6:58 on a Tuesday morning. The glass door of Nexora Financial's server room sighed open, and Sloan Mercer stepped inside for the first time as CEO. Her heels struck the polished floor, once then fell silent. A man lay slumped across his keyboard, one cheek pressed flat against the plastic, a half-empty coffee gone cold beside his hand. Behind him, 14 monitors burned red. Warning lines slid down the glass like rain on a windshield. Soundless and endless. She did not ask his name. She did not lean closer. Her voice cut through the hum of the cooling fans even, and final, remove him. Revoke his badge. He is finished here. Marcus Ellery never opened his mouth. 4 hours later, Sloan would walk back into this same room and understand far too late what she had truly done. So what had really happened the night before? The day before Sloan Mercer took control of Nexora Financial, the city looked like any other Monday. Manhattan was still warm with late September sun, and on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, the servers that quietly moved roughly $4 billion between the country's largest banks each day were humming in their refrigerated racks, oblivious to the storm already gathering against them. Marcus Ellery had been a quiet fixture in that building for 9 years. He was 37 now, lean in the way men get when they forget to eat lunch more often than they remember, and he was the only person left in the company who still understood the original architecture from end to end. He had inherited the encryption layer back when Nexora was a scrappy startup operating out of a leased office in Queens. He had watched 4 different chief technology officers come and go, each one promising to rewrite the legacy core next quarter, each one leaving before they could. The old system had been patched and bridged and patched again, and only Marcus carried the full map of it in his head. He did not advertise that fact. He did not put it in his email signature. He simply arrived at 7, ate a sandwich at his desk at noon, and tried to get home in time to cook dinner. There was a reason he tried. His son's name was Theo, and Theo was 9, the kind of child teachers described in careful, slightly puzzled phrases like old for his age. Theo's mother had died when he was 4, and since then, the small 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn had become a universe of 2 people who lived very gently around each other's silences. Theo did his homework at the kitchen table while his father cooked. Theo read books that other 9-year-olds did not read. Theo had decided somewhere very early in his life that asking why his father came home late would not help anything, so he stopped asking. 3 blocks uptown in a corner office on the 53rd floor of a different tower, Sloan Mercer was reading her own briefing for the 10th time that night. She was 31 years old, and she had just bought Nexora Financial for $3.4 billion. Most of the trade press that week had used the word audacious. A smaller portion had used the word reckless. She had read both, and she was the kind of person who read both. Her name had been built in venture capital quick, clean surgical bets on early-stage software companies. Her track record was the kind that made older men stop interrupting her at conferences. But Nexora was a different animal. Nexora was a living machine with 2,000 corporate clients and a daily transaction volume that did not stop for weekends or for new ownership. For the first time in her career, she would be running a system she did not personally understand at the engineering level. The board knew this. The financial press, which had a long memory and a very short patience for women. Her age running things this large, knew this most of all. Tomorrow morning she intended to walk into that building unannounced and demonstrate in the only way she knew how that she had not bought something she could not run. What she did not yet know was that in a quiet pocket of the same building, she would soon walk into Marcus Ellery had just stopped breathing. He had been pulling what was supposed to be a routine audit on the interbank authentication gateway, the digital handshake that confirmed every transfer was real before any money actually moved. The audit was supposed to take 20 minutes. He had been on it for 2 hours. His coffee had gone cold beside the keyboard. His eyes were not blinking the way eyes were meant to blink. What he was looking at scrolled across 3 monitors was a pattern. It was very small. It was very polite. A faint sequence of micro-requests, each one well under the threshold that would trigger any automated alarm repeating at irregular intervals across the last 72 hours. Anyone running a normal log review would skim straight past them. The automated security suite already had. That was the entire point of how they were designed. Whoever had built those micro-requests had built them precisely to slide under the floorboards of every monitoring tool the company owned. Marcus knew the shape of it the way a doctor knows the shape of a shadow on a scan. This was not a glitch. This was not a misconfigured client retry. This was someone walking through the building in the dark, drawing a map. They had been inside for at least 3 days. They had not taken anything yet. They were still measuring. He picked up his desk phone and called Garrett Whitman, the interim chief technology officer, who had been holding the seat warm since the last permanent CTO walked out in July. Garrett picked up on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who had been halfway through pouring a drink. Marcus described what he was seeing. He kept it short. He used the words structured intrusion and active reconnaissance, and I believe we have at least 72 hours of unauthorized presence inside the gateway. There was a long stretch of nothing on the other end of the line. Marcus, Garrett's voice was tired in a way that was not about sleep. The new CEO walks in at 7 a.m. tomorrow. $3.4 billion walks in with her. You want me to tell her on her first morning that the company she just bought is already compromised? I want you to tell her the truth. What I want you to do is keep watching it. Do not escalate. Do not touch anything that will throw a flag on the executive dashboard. If it is still there in 12 hours, we will talk. Marcus did not argue. He had worked at Nexora long enough to know what arguing got him. He said, "Understood," and he hung up the phone, and he sat very still in the blue glow of his monitors, while the cleaning staff vacuumed the carpet 2 cubicles away, and a janitor whistled a song from a radio he could not see. 12 hours, Garrett had said. Marcus did the arithmetic in his head. 12 hours from now was 7 in the morning. 7 in the morning was when the new CEO arrived. 7 in the morning was also when the system performed its scheduled health check across the high-value transaction cluster, a routine reboot that had been on the calendar since 2017 and that nobody in current management even remembered was automated. If the intruders were doing what he thought they were doing, and the longer he watched the pattern, the more certain he became, because their probing was clustered very specifically around the high-value cluster. Then 12 hours was exactly enough time for them to finish whatever they were preparing. And the 7 a.m. reboot would be the trigger. He sat with that for a long time, watching his own reflection in the dark glass of the window behind his monitor. A thinner man than he used to be. A little more gray at the temples than last year. A father who had promised that morning to be home, in time to help Theo glue together the cardboard rocket for the Wednesday science fair. He thought about calling the rest of the security team. The senior bench was in Austin until Thursday at a private cloud security summit that had been approved on the calendar months ago, back when nobody could have predicted an attacker would choose this exact week. The on-call engineer tonight was a contractor he had met twice. He thought about that too. He thought about what it would mean to bring a contractor into the first hours of an active intrusion before anyone in leadership had even acknowledged it was happening. And then he thought about something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable. A reconnaissance. This patient, this surgical, this well-tuned to the specific weaknesses of Nexora's specific architecture, had almost certainly involved someone with inside knowledge. He did not know who. He did not want to know who, not tonight. But every name he pulled into this room in the next 12 hours was a name he was choosing on faith to trust. He picked up his phone. He called the apartment in Brooklyn. Theo answered on the second ring the way he always did. "Hey kiddo, listen. Something came up at work. I'm not going to make it home tonight. I'm going to ask Nora from down the hall to come stay until morning. Is that okay?" "Okay," Theo said. "The rocket. I'll do it tomorrow with you," Theo said. "It's okay, Dad. Is something bad happening? Marcus looked at the cascade of small, patient, predatory requests still scrolling on his middle monitor. He took his time deciding how to answer. "There's something at work that needs me to stay until it's fixed," he said. "I'll tell you about it when I see you." "Okay," Theo said again. "Don't forget to heat." The line clicked off. Marcus rolled his chair forward. He cracked his knuckles once very quietly, the way a pianist might before a long passage. He opened a fresh terminal window. The clock on the wall said 6:42 in the evening. He was alone in the building in every way that mattered. He had no orders. He had no team. He had no permission and no safety net, and no second chair to fall back into if his hand started shaking after the 18th hour. All he had was the map inside his head, and a little over 12 hours before, whoever was already inside the building finished what they had come there to do. He started typing. The first 6 hours went the way Marcus had hoped they would, which was to say very slowly and with no one noticing. He worked in layers, around the segments of the gateway that showed the heaviest reconnaissance traffic. He built a series of soft isolation walls, not the kind that would slam shut and announce themselves on every dashboard in the building, but the kind that quietly rerouted suspect traffic into holding cells, where it could be watched without realizing it was being watched. It was the digital equivalent of moving the silverware out of a room while a guest was still inside, smiling, asking where the bathroom was. Every command had to be precise. The legacy core could not be paused for repairs. It was the kind of system you operated on while it was still beating, and a single misrouted packet at the wrong layer could collapse the authentication path for every transfer in the country. By 11 o'clock, his shoulders had begun to ache in a specific, familiar way. By 1 in the morning, the night shift had drifted past his desk 3 separate times without stopping. One of them, a young woman named Jada Holloway, who had been hired in June, slowed at his cubicle long enough to notice the unusual configuration on his middle monitor, then kept walking. She had been told at orientation that Marcus Ellery handled the legacy stuff, and that the legacy stuff was not anyone else's problem. She filed away what she had seen the way a junior nurse files away a chart she does not yet have permission to read. At 2 in the morning, Marcus stood up to refill his water bottle and discovered that his left leg had gone fully numb. He shook it out against the side of his desk, like a swimmer working a cramp. He stood at the window for 30 seconds, looking out at the river and the few barge lights crawling south, and he allowed himself to consider quietly the possibility that he was wrong about everything. That Garrett was right, and this was nothing. He almost wanted that to be true. He sat back down. He kept working. At 3 a.m. he found it. The way it surfaced was almost gentle, a single misaligned timestamp in a dormant memory segment of the high-value transaction cluster, the part of the system that handled transfers above $5 million. The misalignment should not have been there. He chased it for 20 minutes. He chased it through 3 layers of the cluster's verification logic. And then, very slowly, the picture assembled itself in front of him, and he understood with a clarity that made his hands cold what he was actually looking at. The intruders had not just been mapping, they had been planting. Buried inside the high-value cluster was a payload, a piece of code so quiet it was effectively invisible during normal operation. It did nothing. It did not phone home. It did not consume measurable resources. It sat there like a seed in winter soil doing absolutely nothing until a very specific event woke it up. That event was a reboot. The high-value cluster ran a scheduled health check reboot every morning at 6 a.m. It had run that same reboot on that same schedule every morning for 9 years. Nobody on the current team had touched the schedule in at least 3. Nobody in leadership remembered it existed. When that reboot fired in the morning, the payload would unspool itself during the brief window when the cluster's authentication state was rebuilding. By the time the cluster came back online, every soft isolation wall Marcus had spent the night building would be gone, and the payload would have inserted itself into the rebuilt authentication path. Outbound transactions would still appear to complete. Confirmations would still flow. But the actual money, the real funds moving between actual American banks, would be quietly rerouted through validation servers that did not belong to Nexora at all. By the time anyone on the floor noticed the discrepancy, the morning peak window would already be live, and tens of millions of dollars would be in motion through doors the company did not own. It was elegant, it was patient, and it was timed almost insultingly to detonate during the first business hours of the new CEO's first day. Then he stopped thinking and started moving. The most important thing was the reboot itself. He pulled up the scheduler and disabled the automated health check on the high-value cluster manually, with a hard override that would not be reversed by the next configuration sync. He documented the override, noted the reason, and time-stamped the entry. He moved on. Over the next 90 minutes, he reinforced his isolation walls around the cluster, deepened the holding cells, where the reconnaissance traffic was being passively absorbed, and began drafting the handoff document, the one he intended to walk into Garrett Whitman's office with at 7 a.m. sharp, the moment the man arrived. He laid it out the way he would lay out a surgical procedure, every step he had taken, every command he had issued, every line of the suspect traffic he had captured, every recommendation for the next 12 hours. He labeled the sections in plain language because he had been in this industry long enough to know that documents written for engineers do not survive contact with executives. At the very top of the document, in larger type than the rest, he wrote, "If I am not present, do not reboot any core service." This is a staged attack. The payload activates on reboot. Call me immediately. He typed his personal cell number underneath. He saved the document to the shared drive to his own desktop and printed 2 physical copies on the laser printer behind the kitchenette. He placed one copy on his keyboard. He placed the second copy on Garrett's desk, weighted under a coffee mug. It was 4:47 in the morning. His vision had begun doing something strange at the edges, a soft graying in, the kind that happens when the body has decided on its own authority that it is finished negotiating. He had not eaten since the sandwich at noon the previous day. His hands, when he held them out flat in front of him, were trembling at a frequency he did not entirely trust. He told himself he would close his eyes for 10 minutes. He set a mental alarm. He folded his arms on the desk and lowered his head. His body went down like a stone into water. The cleaning crew passed through his row at 5:15 and did not disturb him. The night shift supervisor logged off at 5:45 without doing her final walk because a personal call had run long. Jada Holloway, finishing her shift, glanced at him on her way to the elevator and assumed the way the rest of the floor had always assumed that Marcus Ellery was simply doing whatever Marcus Ellery did, and that it was not her place to ask. The morning shift began trickling in at 6:30. None of them had been on the floor the night before. None of them knew there was a printed document under a coffee mug in an office down the hall. At 6:58, Sloane Mercer pushed open the glass door of the server room. She had not slept much either, but for very different reasons. She had left her apartment at 6:15 in the kind of mood that did not announce itself with any visible sign, a tightness behind the sternum, a low electricity in the jaw. Her assistant had been told to expect her at the executive floor at 8. She had not told her assistant about the unannounced detour through the operations floor first. She wanted to see the building before the building had time to arrange itself for her. There was something else too, though she would not have admitted it to anyone in the company. A year and a half earlier, in a different deal, she had trusted a senior engineer she liked. He had been calm and articulate and deeply embedded in his system, and he had walked out of that company 2 weeks after her acquisition closed with a portion of the code base she had not realized was portable. The lawsuit had been settled. The press had not been kind. She had read 3 weeks ago an unsigned op-ed in a financial daily that referred to her by initials only as the buyer who cannot tell loyalty from theater. She had not been able to finish the article. She had also not been able to forget it. So when she pushed open the glass door of the server room and saw a man slumped over his keyboard, while every monitor behind him bled red, what she saw wasn't a man. What she saw was the shape of every story she was trying not to become. She did not lean closer. She did not check the badge clipped to his lanyard. She turned to the security officer standing one step behind her, the one who had been instructed that morning to accompany her on her walkthrough, and she gave the order in the same even voice she used for everything else. "Remove him. Revoke his badge. He's finished here." Marcus came up out of sleep the way a diver comes up out of deep water, too fast, ears ringing the room, sliding sideways for 2 full seconds before it locked into place. There was a hand on his shoulder. There was a woman standing 6 feet from his desk in a charcoal suit he half recognized from a photograph. There were 2 security officers, one on each side of him, and one of them was already unclipping his badge from his lanyard. He tried to speak. His mouth was dry in a way that made the first word fail entirely. "Wait, you can collect personal items later," Sloane said, not looking at him. "There is a Mr." She glanced at the badge in the security officer's hand, the only time her eyes touched him at all. "Ellery, you can collect your items later." The morning shift had begun gathering at the perimeter of the room, without quite admitting that they were gathering. Reed Calloway, the senior infrastructure engineer, who had come in early to prepare the briefing materials for the new CEO's introduction, at 9, was standing in the doorway, with a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other, and his face had gone a particular shade of careful that Marcus would think about much later with something close to compassion. Marcus pulled what little clarity he had left into a single sentence. He aimed it at the room rather than at Sloane, because Sloane was already turning away. "Do not," he said, loud enough for everyone on the floor to hear, "let the system reboot. Anything. Any service. Do not." A few faces turned. A few did not. Sloane did not turn. She was already walking toward the elevator bank, the security officers escorting Marcus in the opposite direction, and within 90 seconds, the glass door of the server room had closed again behind him, and the printed copy of the handoff document was still sitting on his keyboard, half covered by the elbow of a junior engineer who had already moved into his chair to begin pulling up the morning dashboards. By 8 a.m., Marcus was on the sidewalk in front of the building with a cardboard box and a personal phone he was too tired to look at. He hailed a cab on autopilot. He gave the driver the Brooklyn address. He sat in the back seat with the box on his knees and watched the bridge slide past in the morning light. And he understood in a distant, abstract way that he had just been fired and that some larger thing was going to happen because of it, and that there was nothing left in his body with which to fight any of it. He climbed the 4 flights to his apartment. He let himself in. Theo had already left for school. The cardboard rocket was sitting on the kitchen table, half finished exactly where they had left it on Sunday. Marcus made it as far as the sofa. He sat down. He did not remember lying down. The phone by then on silent was on the coffee table beside a cold mug from the night before last. At 11:07, the floor at Nexora began to feel wrong. The first sign was a small one, a Q-depth metric on the high-value cluster ticking upward in a way that did not match the morning's transaction volume. Reed noticed it. The shift lead, a man named Owen Brazier, noticed it about 90 seconds later. Memory pressure was climbing. Latency on interbank confirmations was beginning to creep above threshold. To anyone who had run that cluster for a few years, the shape was extremely familiar. It was the shape of a service that needed to be cycled. Owen called for a restart of the cluster's authentication service. Jada Holloway, 3 desks away, looked up sharply. She had been on the floor when Marcus had said the words. She had not understood them at the time. She understood now that she had heard them. She raised her hand halfway and lowered it again. She tried once. "Hey, Mr. Ellery said he said not to reboot anything." Owen looked at her over the rim of his glasses. His voice was not unkind, but it was final. "He was let go this morning, Jada. Run the restart." The command went out at 11:13. 90 seconds later, every wall Marcus had built during the night came apart in the order he had built them in reverse. The payload woke up inside the rebuilding cluster the way it had always been designed to. The high-value authentication path reformed itself around code that did not belong to Nexora. Outbound confirmations continued to flow, calm and reassuring, exactly as designed. And somewhere behind the curtain, the actual transfers, the real money, moving between real banks, began routing themselves through validation servers in a data center the company had never heard of. The phone started ringing at 11:19. By 11:24, the floor was red. Sloan was on the executive floor when the first call came up. She had been in her new office for less than 2 hours. She had not yet finished arranging the small things on the desk: a fountain pen, a leather notebook, the framed photograph of a horse she had owned briefly in her 20s. Her assistant knocked, once opened the door without waiting, and said the words, "Operations floor," in a voice that did not sound like her assistant's normal voice. Sloan did not ask for details. She picked up the suit jacket she had hung on the back of the chair, and she walked to the elevator. The way a person walks toward weather, they can already feel changing. The doors opened on the operations floor, and the smell hit her, first the particular dry electric smell of a room where nobody has stopped moving in 20 minutes. Phones were ringing at 3 different desks. Someone was reading numbers off a screen in a low, fast voice. A printer somewhere behind the partition was producing pages no one was picking up. Every monitor she could see from the doorway was running red. Reed Calloway met her at the entrance. His face was the color of old paper. "Ma'am, tell me." At 11:13 this morning, the shift lead authorized a restart of the high-value cluster authentication service. The cluster came back online 90 seconds later in a compromised state. Outbound confirmations are still completing, but the underlying transfers are being routed through validation servers we do not control. We are estimating conservatively somewhere between $40 and $60 million, currently in motion through external infrastructure. Every isolation attempt we have run in the last 20 minutes has either failed or produced cascading errors in adjacent services. Sloan heard all of it. Her face did not change. "Who authorized the restart?" "Owen Brass here, shift lead. Standard call given the symptoms. There was a junior engineer who tried to flag it. She said Mr. Ellery had instructed the floor not to reboot anything. She was overruled." "Ellery, the man you let go this morning." The hum of the cooling fans was very loud suddenly in the small distance between them. "Show me whatever he left behind," Sloan said. Reed led her to Marcus's old desk. The printed handoff document was still there, partly under the elbow of a different engineer, who had not yet realized the stack of paper underneath him was the most important object in the building. Reed lifted it out and handed it to her without comment. She read it standing up. The timestamps were clean. The captured traffic samples were annotated. The recommendations were laid out in the order a person would actually need to execute them. At the bottom of the first page in larger type were the words she would think about much later when she could not sleep. "If I am not present, do not reboot any core service. This is a staged attack. The payload activates on reboot. Call me immediately." The personal cell number was printed underneath in the same enlarged type. Sloan took her phone out of her jacket pocket. She dialed. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She dialed again. Same result. She dialed a 3rd time. She turned to Reed. "Address. Personnel file." Now, she drove herself across the bridge with her phone face down on the passenger seat. She did not turn on the radio. She had spent her whole career rehearsing what she was going to say, and at some point in the last hour, something in her had quietly stopped doing that. The apartment building in Brooklyn was a 4-story walk-up with a green awning and a security door propped open by a folded pizza menu. She climbed the stairs. She knocked. The door opened the width of a chain. A boy looked up at her through the gap. He was thin in the way children are when they grow faster than they eat, with round wire glasses and a paperback book held against his chest, with one finger marking the page. "Are you here for my dad?" "Yes." The boy studied her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Whatever criteria he was using, she did not pass or fail in any visible way. He simply unhooked the chain and stepped back. He's on the couch. He hasn't woken up. The apartment smelled like coffee and warm radiator dust, and the faint, sweet smell of something being held together by a child without supervision. Theo did not lead her in. He simply walked back to the kitchen table and sat down in front of an unfinished cardboard rocket with a glue stick in one hand and his book in the other. And Sloane understood, without anyone explaining it, that this was a household where adults did not need to be escorted. Marcus was on the sofa exactly the way Reed's description of his morning suggested he would be. He was still in the gray jacket he had worn to work the night before. His shoes were still on. His laptop was open on the coffee table beside him, the screen dark but the power light steady, and a remote dashboard was minimized in the corner of the wallpaper she could just make out. The mug beside the laptop was full to the brim with coffee that had gone the color of slate. Sloane took 2 steps into the living room and stopped. She had walked into a great many rooms in her life with the intention of fixing them. She was not by training or by temperament a person who stood still in the middle of someone else's apartment with no agenda and no sentence prepared. But there was something about the specific arrangement of the room that did not invite the version of herself she usually arrived as. Theo's voice came from the kitchen, conversational, not whispered. He hasn't slept since yesterday morning. He told me there was something bad happening at his work, and he had to be there until it was done. Yes, Sloane said. Is it done? She turned to look at the boy. He had not lifted his eyes from his book. The question had been asked in the same tone with which he might have asked whether the laundry had finished spinning. No, she said, because lying to this child seemed in that moment like a particularly cheap thing to do. It is not. Theo nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already privately suspected, and turned a page. She crossed the room. She crouched beside the sofa. She touched Marcus's shoulder lightly. He came up out of sleep in stages. His eyes opened. They tracked the ceiling. They tracked the lamp. They tracked her. There was no moment on his face of pleasant confusion. The recognition arrived already exhausted. He had clearly, somewhere in the back of his sleeping mind, been expecting her to be there. Mr. Ellery, Marcus is fine. Marcus! Her voice was quieter than it had been at any point that morning. I fired you before you finished a sentence. I was wrong. The system at Nexora is collapsing, and there is no one in that building who understands what you built last night. I am asking you to come back. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his head slowly toward the kitchen. Theo, did you eat lunch? I had a cheese sandwich and an apple. Nora came by at 12. Homework? Mostly done. Is Nora still here? She went back to her place. She said to call if I need her. Marcus brought his eyes back to Sloane. There was no triumph in them, and no resentment either. There was only the flat tiredness of a man who had been delivered an additional weight he had not asked to carry. I will come back, he said. Not for your apology. There are real businesses on the other end of those transactions. Real people who are going to have payroll fail this Friday if this is not contained. I am coming back for them. Understood. He stood up. The room did something for a moment that he did not show on his face. He walked into the bedroom, changed his shirt, came back out, kissed the top of Theo's head, said the words, I will be home for dinner if I can, and if I can't, Nora will come sit with you, and picked up his laptop bag. On her way out, Sloane's eyes caught something small and pink on the edge of the kitchen table, a rocket-shaped eraser sitting beside the half-built cardboard rocket. Without thinking about why, she picked it up and put it in her jacket pocket. They were back on the operations floor at 12:41. Marcus did not sit down. He stood at the center of the floor with the printed handoff document in one hand and a marker in the other, and he assigned. Reed took the routing isolation. Jada, who had said the words out loud that morning, even when no one wanted to hear them, was put on the held transaction queue with 2 senior engineers reporting to her. Owen Brazier was given the job of coordinating with the receiving banks because Owen's mistake that morning had been a mistake of judgment rather than competence, and Marcus had been in the industry long enough to know the difference. He worked the payload himself. 14 configuration changes across the rebuilt authentication path, each one tested against the captured traffic samples from the night before, each one confirmed by Reed before it went live. He closed the route the attackers had built over the previous 4 days. He sealed the door behind it. By 2 in the afternoon, the bleeding had stopped. By 3, the held transactions were beginning to settle back into their proper destinations. By 4, every dollar that had been in motion through the external validation servers had been accounted for, recovered, or formally written into a recovery process with the receiving banks. Nothing was lost. Not one transfer. The board meeting was called for 5 p.m. It was held in the executive conference room on the 53rd floor, with 3 directors physically present, and the rest on a secured video bridge. Garrett Whitman was there looking like a man who had spent the afternoon rehearsing a version of events in which he was a cautious steward rather than the bottleneck he had actually been. The room did what rooms full of senior people do in the first hours. After a near disaster, it began gently, and almost without anyone noticing, to distribute the responsibility into a fine mist. Phrases like process gap began to appear. Phrases like structural ambiguity in the escalation path. Sloan let it run for about 4 minutes. Then she stood up. This morning at 7:02, she said, "I fired Marcus Ellery before he completed a single sentence. I saw a man asleep at a keyboard, and I made a decision in under 3 seconds because the image fit a story I had already decided I wanted to tell about this company. I was wrong. That decision nearly cost us this institution. It would have cost us this institution if Mr. Ellery had been a different kind of person, and if a junior engineer named Jada Holloway had not tried, in a room full of people senior to her, to repeat what he had told us. I am not interested in this room in language about process gaps. The process did not fail. I failed. Let us proceed from there." The room got quiet in the specific way. Rooms get quiet when something true and expensive has just been said, without protective coating around it. Garrett Whitman did not meet her eyes. He would 3 weeks later be asked to take an early retirement, and he would take it. Marcus was offered the role that night. Chief Infrastructure Security Officer reporting line direct to the CEO. He took the offer home, had dinner with Theo, and finished the cardboard rocket. The next morning, he came back with 3 written conditions: a permanent direct escalation channel from infrastructure security to the office of the CEO with no intermediary review, a hard staffing standard that would prevent any single engineer from becoming the only person capable of holding a critical system together through exhaustion, including specifically himself, and a written policy protecting any employee who reported a genuine security concern from any form of organizational retaliation, defined in operational rather than aspirational language. Sloan read the 3 conditions. She signed them in the order he had handed them to her. She did not negotiate a single word. The attack itself was traced in the weeks that followed to a coordinated group whose infrastructure had also been used against 2 other North American financial firms. The timing aligned almost too neatly with the ownership transition, suggested that whoever had built the operation had wanted not just money, but a public failure attached to a specific name. 3 weeks later, Sloan was crossing the main lobby of the Nexora Tower at 5:40 in the afternoon when she saw them. Marcus was crouched in front of one of the long benches near the windows, his suit jacket folded over the armrest, one hand resting on the small shoulder of the boy in front of him. Theo had clearly just been picked up from an after-school program. There was a folder under his arm and a smudge of something blue near his ear, and he was telling his father, in a voice climbing the small, bright ladder of a child who has actually been delighted by something, about an experiment involving a balloon and a jar and a piece of cardboard. The face Sloan had seen on Marcus through the longest day of her professional life The controlled face. The surgical face. The face that had assigned tasks across an operations floor while the building was on fire was not the face she was looking at now. The man crouched in front of his son was somewhere underneath the other one, softer, fully present, lit from inside, in a way no amount of professional competence could ever produce. She did not walk toward them right away. She had learned in the last 3 weeks to recognize moments that belonged to other people. When she did cross the lobby, it was without title and without agenda. She crouched down at the edge of the bench, putting herself at Theo's eye level, and she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, the same jacket she had not entirely meant to admit to herself, and she took out the small, pink, rocket-shaped eraser she had been carrying since the afternoon she had found it in her hand on the bridge. "I think this belongs to you," she said. "I picked it up from your kitchen table. I should have given it back sooner." Theo looked at the eraser, then at her. He took it carefully with the slightly grave expression of a child, accepting the return of something he had quietly, privately missed. "Thank you," he said. Marcus stood up. He met her eyes. There was no leftover tension. There was no manufactured warmth. There was only the look of two people who had walked through the same difficult thing from opposite sides and had ended up neither of them entirely intending to in a place they could both stand. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing the thing Manhattan light does in early October, long, low gold, along the upper floors of the towers across the avenue. A boy held a small, rocket-shaped eraser in his fist. Two adults stood close enough to actually see each other. Power without listening is not strength. It is a very expensive kind of blindness. And sometimes the most costly lesson arrives wearing the face of the person you assumed was only sleeping.